Hello everyone, and thank you for having a look at our Chapter 12 presentation on survey designs. Let's get started. First, let's begin by taking a look at what survey research is, how it developed, and when you use it. In survey research design, researchers collect quantitative numbered data utilizing questionnaires, and then implement statistics to analyze the data, test the research questions, and describe trends found in the analysis. Survey research determines individual opinions, beliefs, and attitudes, as well as describes trends. Survey research provides less explanatory statements and more relationship correlations, or expands on specific information about a population. The history behind survey designs highlights their development between World War I and World War II. Survey research developed due to improving sampling techniques and the development of diverse scales of measurement. During this period, the U.S. Department of Agriculture formalized survey research by developing written standardized guidelines and the Likert scale, which is a significant instrument used in survey research today. The primary use of survey research is in marketing, journalism, public opinion, and with organizations and charities. Survey research is an essential tool in garnering opinions of a specific population, learning about beliefs, and evaluating the success of an intervention within a community. In higher education, survey research is an essential component in assessment and is used throughout the various functional areas governing higher ed. There are two types of survey designs: cross-sectional and longitudinal. Cross-sectional survey designs are the most popular types of surveys used by researchers. The main characteristic of cross-sectional survey design is that the researcher collects data at one point in time. A primary advantage of the cross-sectional design is its capacity to measure opinions, perspectives, and attitudes at that singular point in time. It can also be used to compare two groups so that researchers can better understand where the differences or similarities lie. Communities, such as schools, institutions, or organizations, can also use this design to assess needs for intervention or planning. In general, there are several types of cross-sectional designs, including those that examine attitudes, beliefs, opinions, and practices of individuals, compare two or more groups, and those that evaluate community needs or evaluate a program. Longitudinal survey designs allow researchers to gather information about a particular population over a longer period of time, collecting information at regular intervals or examining trends. The main characteristic of longitudinal survey design is that the researcher collects data over a period of time. The types of longitudinal survey designs are trend studies, cohort studies, and panel studies. Trend studies focus on a specific characteristic or trend, and over the course of time, measures how that characteristic changes within a snapshot of a population. For example, a survey of veteran satisfaction with VA GI benefits where veteran students entering college for the first year are interviewed. Every year the participants change, but the characteristics of the participants remain the same. Cohort studies examine a specific population over the course of time. The participants may change or remain the same, but data is gathered regarding the evolution of that population. Panel studies focus on the same individual participants over the course of time and follow the experiences of those participants. Key characteristics of survey research. The key characteristics of survey research are sampling from a population, collecting data via questionnaire or interview, designing instruments for data collection, and obtaining a high response rate. Regarding population sampling, survey researchers typically will take the results from a sample population and generalize those results to apply to the population. In using survey research, we understand population at the broadest level to be a group of individuals posing one characteristic which distinguishes them from other groups. Researchers study a target population, also known as a sampling form. These are individuals from the targeted population that the research can obtain. The sample is the group of survey participants chosen from the target population from which the researcher generalizes to the target population. Kabla-Tungan and McCarthy exemplified this when they sampled a population of undergraduate students with a target population of college affiliates with the American Council on Education and had administrators provide random sample of 215 students from each. Questionnaires and interviews. A questionnaire completed by participants in a survey and returned to the researcher. A participant chooses to answer questions and provide basic, personal, or demographic information to the researcher. An interview study is different in that researchers ask questions from the interview guide and records the answers provided by the participants. There are several types of questionnaires and interviews used in quantitative research. The major types used in education are mailed questionnaires, online questionnaires, one-on-one interviews, focus group interviews, and telephone interviews. Instrumental design. Designing one's own instrument for surveys can be both complex and challenging. If there is a survey instrument available, or if there are other instruments that can be modified to suit one's needs, consider these options first. If neither are available, researchers will typically perform 3 steps. They write different types of questions, they use strategies for good question construction, and they perform pilot tests of the questions. Response rate. A higher response rate from participants in a study gives the researcher more confidence to generalize the results and apply them to a larger population under the study. The percentage of questionnaires that participants return is known as the response return rate. The response return rate will vary depending on a few different factors like proper notification, adequate follow-up procedures, respondent interest in the study, the quality of the instrument, and the use of incentives. Many of the survey studies that are in leading educational journals report a response rate of about 50% or better. Constructing and using a questionnaire. There are 2 types of questionnaires used in educational research. They are either mailed or completed online. Questionnaires can be developed directly by the researchers from other existing literature or by using software programs such as Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey. Participants complete or record the data when questionnaires are used. Well-constructed questionnaires are short, easy to read, and easy to return. In a study on the needs of college students in STEM, a researcher created an online survey for participants consisting of 57 multiple-choice questions. The first 13 questions pertained to demographic information like age, major, gender, class level, etc. The other 44 questions pertain to the student's academic and social experiences at the undergraduate institution, their financial pressure, perception of the academic environment, and faculty support. Instrumental design. There are several types of questions at a researcher's disposal. These questions include closed questions, which will typically result in a yes or no answer or have prescribed answers. Open questions, which allow for participants to provide feedback on specific questions, and semi-closed answers, which prescribe answers but allow participants to expand if no option applies. Questions can be designed to glean information about personal characteristics, attitudes, or behavior of participants. When questions are created about sensitive topics, construction is an essential consideration. A palatable construction can yield a higher response rate. For all questions within an instrument, researchers must consider their strategy and the composition of their questions in their approach. Typical pitfalls for researchers include unclear questions, wordy questions, questions that include jargon or technical language not understood by participants, negatively phrased questions, or generally confusing questions such as those that include multiple questions in one or have unbalanced options. A good way to navigate these pitfalls is to implement the use of pilot testing, allowing for feedback on initial questions. Constructing and using an interview. There are 3 types of interviews used in educational research: one-on-one, focus group, or telephone. In one-on-one interviews, researchers conduct interviews using closed-ended questions. In focus group interviews, the group discusses and answers questions when all responses are recorded by the researcher and a consensus is reached. Telephone interviews are similar to one-on-one interviews, but participants can be geographically diverse. Researchers complete or record data when interviews are used. One-on-one interviews have a significant advantage for researchers, specifically those looking to explore sensitive topics or those who have chosen to build a method that allows for expansion of follow-up questions and comments. Generally, one-on-one interviews also offer a higher response rate for participants given the level of scheduling necessary for coordination. Disadvantages of one-on-one interviews include the possibility of a lack of anonymity for the participants given the personal interaction. There is also a possibility of interviewers to influence participants through visible or audible responses that modify the content of the participant's response to questions. For example, if during an interview for a study of fraternity members and the relationship of membership and academic success, a researcher reacts negative facially to a participant explaining their organization's intake process, the participant may be less likely to share further information or respond honestly to the interviewer in later questions. Focus group interviews are another method of interviewing which are generally held in person, but in small groups of participants. Like one-on-one interviews, researchers ask prescribed questions of the group and take notes. Focus groups hold many of the similar advantages and disadvantages as the one-on-one interviewing, but add a layer of consensus that is necessary for researchers to gather from the group. Focus groups also allow for greater level of interpersonal difficulty among participants, and that one voice can potentially dominate the group and skew the data. Though telephone interviewing has decreased recently with the advent of online instruments, it offers a unique set of advantages to researchers. Interpersonal contact with researchers and participants can improve response rates according to the text. Telephone interviews allow for well-trained interviewers to engage with participants, but also introduce measurement of error into the study. Interviewers must be well-trained and consistent in all interviews via the phone to ensure accurate data. Other advantages include telephone interviewing, providing probabilistic sampling, often using tools that have the capability of dialing randomly listed phone numbers within a directory. Though it should be noted that over time, landline phones have decreased in popularity, inhibiting efficacy. How to conduct and design an interview. In regards to the stance of an interviewer, a researcher should remain neutral on personal opinions, maintain a positive tone while asking questions, and also maintain a neutral appearance. Training interviewers. There are a few different ways to prepare an interviewer to conduct an interview. Consider role-playing demonstrations by an experienced researcher and a practice interview by the researcher who will conduct the interview. An interviewer should become familiar with the questions and cover any potential interruptions that can arise during the interview. To avoid any problems that can arise, the interviewer should not deviate from the interview plan, not bring certain expectations to the interviewee's answers, dress appropriately, and be respectful. Specifically, training for one-on-one interviews is essential given the unique skill sets interviewers must employ. An interviewer must ask all participants exact questions, provide streamlined instructions, limit interruptions, and ensure tone and cadence is consistent for all interviews. In person, this is extremely important as variants can introduce bias into a study. Steps in interviewing. The first step is to obtain interview survey and train individual interviewers. Step number 2 is to gain access to interviewees through formal invitation, also known as a cover letter. Step number 3 is to ask questions, indicate response options, and record answers. Step number 4, you should end by thanking the interviewees and tell them the next step. Number 5, after the interview, the researcher should write down comments and specifics about the situation as well as record personal feelings. Ethical issues in survey research. With all forms of research, just the same as survey research, includes a set of ethical guidelines in place to ensure the safety of participants, integrity of the research, and consistent practices within the field. As with all research, survey research is required to be reviewed by an institutional review board. However, many times survey research receives an exemption unless it includes vulnerable populations or sensitive information. Incentives may also be implemented to assist with a high response rate. However, they may not be so large that ethical issues arise regarding participation. Overall, researchers are required to ensure the safety of all parties in the study, including participants and interviewers. All of the information conveyed should be accurate, and procedures should be created to ensure overall well-being. Because most survey research implements anonymous submission, confidentiality of respondents is also necessary to remain protected. Lastly, researchers are responsible for retaining data in accordance with federal standards. Within the United States, this is a 3-year period and in compliance with individual institution review boards. An example of an ethical dilemma presented in the chapter: a city was conducting a count of homeless population in order to accurately reflect the amount of need for the homeless population. They hired a team to pose as homeless people. They were to dress for the part, go to designated areas described as project apartment complexes in teams of 2, and stay the night at the entrance of the buildings. Their jobs were to see if they were counted or not. What do you think? Does this sound ethical? Final overview and process. Deciding on survey research. Surveys can be used to assist trends or characteristics of populations within higher education. You can also learn about individual attitudes, beliefs, or needs for a specific population, such as the study habits of student athletes. Survey research can also be used to assist the efficacy of a program, which in higher education is often used in retention or satisfaction initiatives. Advantages of survey research. The advantages of conducting survey research are important to consider when making your decision. One advantage is that survey research can be conducted in a short period of time. Survey research can also reach a wide population through an economical means. However, one of the most important advantages of survey research is that wide swaths of participants can be assisted through anonymous means, ideally without bias. Disadvantages of survey research. Some disadvantages of survey research is its reliance on self-reported information from participants. It can also be difficult to receive adequate responses that are unbiased. One of the primary disadvantages lies within the core of tenant research. Survey research does not control for many variables to explain the relationship between the independent and dependent variables, as they do not typically include open-ended questions. However, it should be noted that semi-closed questions are a possible remedy. Identifying questions and hypotheses. Surveys generally have the capacity to address hypotheses and survey research questions through their design. Drawing inferences from the population being surveyed. Choosing specific research questions are an essential component of survey instrument development. Research questions can generally describe trends, compare groups, or relate to 2 or more variables to examine a relationship. Identifying a population. Sample frame and sample. As researchers think about specific questions, it's important for them to consider the population being analyzed. Once a population has been specified, it may be necessary to stratify the grouping in order to ensure accurate representation within the group. Researchers can do this after obtaining specific names from the individuals within that group or category. Lastly, researchers select a probability sampling procedure in order to acquire a sample, ensuring an adequate size through a sampling error formula, and finally arrive at the sample of their population to be used within the survey, determining data collections and procedures. Data collection is a significant consideration as researchers determine if a design will be cross-sectional or longitudinal. Researchers also need to consider their methods, such as focus group interviews or telephone surveys, for example. These factors will impact the duration of data collection, the type of data collected, and the necessary mechanisms for data an analyst required. Implementation of survey research. Implementation of survey research is quite simple in name, but requires the most time of any step in survey research. This step requires obtaining permission from participants, training staff such as those who will be interviewing participants, and following up to ensure high responses from the selected sample. Researchers must also check for response bias in the case of questionnaires and prepare overall data transition into analysis. Analysis and reporting. Data analysis procedures are contingent upon types of research questions. For example, descriptive research questions generally require a specific analysis. Researchers will also be checking for response bias, conducting a descriptive analysis, and possibly testing hypotheses or research questions. Analysis may involve inferential statistics. Researchers then surmise outcomes and seek to share those outcomes with stakeholders and their specific audience through the publication of a report. Generally, within survey design, these reports will follow the prescriptive style discussed prior, but methods will be highlighted with specific survey information. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoy the presentation and have a good one. Bye.